This is Amy Moritz, and I am a member of the Shalom Band Institute. We are a group of people from diverse backgrounds that find our work converging at the intersection of what we say is systems, stories, and spirit. And today I am joined by fellow band member, Dr. Fred Smith, who's going to help us kind of unpack what it is that we mean by systems, stories, and spirit, and how it is that if we pay attention to this intersection at this time, we might begin to really realize the deep transformative change that we all desire. So welcome, Dr. Fred Smith. I'd love it if you could help just begin to introduce us to systems, stories, and spirit.
Okay. On one of our conference calls, we began to think about what would be our tagline, or how we might be able to identify, how be able to identify or develop a logo that may encapsulate experiences in our intellectual pursuits, as well as our practical work that we do. And after listening to our conversations over several weeks, there were several themes that kept coming up over and over again. One is story. You know, that seems to be a foundation or bedrock for most of us. But the issues that we address oftentimes are described as systemic or systems oriented or systems, you know, all kinds of system kind of stuff. But also what impressed for me, I'm a theologian, you know, and a pastor and a minister, and most of us also have some kind of religious background. And what I began to understand and thinking about, especially the New Testament scholar Walter Wink, that systems have spirits. Okay, he called them angels. I call them spirits, but it's even more than that, you know, more than the religious understanding of spirit. So when I talk about spirit here, I'm not necessarily talking about a religious notion of spirit, but more of a phenomenological approach to spirit. Spirit as a phenomenon that could be both good or evil, or holy or cruel. I mean, but it's a spirit, and I will talk more about that later. But anyway, I began to toy in with those three phrases. And I began to jot down some thoughts that came to mind. And I'm going to start off by reading just my handwritten work that I did in my journal as I began to think about this, okay? So, systems are the manifestation of the dominant narrative of society. By that I mean story. Stories, systems, they are the product, and at the time they produce a historical narrative. That is, stories or systems are part of historical narratives that shape our institutions, our organizations, our governance, our systems, that shape our collective and individual stories. Stories for me are the meaning-making instruments of human beings. We make meaning of ourselves and our world through the stories that we tell. So therefore, stories are instruments that shape our lives, and therefore the life force of the spirit. We discern our spirit through our stories, oftentimes, that we tell. And so the life force that comes from us, that shapes us, that makes us, that connects us to our environment is our spirit. Systems and stories all are endued with spirit, and this spirit is what connects us to ourselves deeply. We oftentimes call that spirituality, to our deeper selves, to other people in both positive and negative ways, the spirits of our communities, so to speak. But it also connects us to the earth. You know, we are bound to the earth and to the natural environment, or our ecology, you know, together. But even more important than that, or as important as that, depending upon your perspective and point of view, spirit connects us to that transcends, that is beyond both nature, beyond ourselves, beyond the systems that we make, but it's something that we consider is greater. You know, it has many names. It can be called infinite intelligence. It can be called God, Allah, Buddha. I mean, there are many. It can be called prophets. You know, ideology, anything that manifests itself as larger than ourselves, that we hold ourselves accountable to in some fashion or some way. And so for me, spirit, stories, and systems are tightly interrelated. there's a relationship. The relationship is not linear. It's not one other than the other, but I think it's more of a spiral or circular. And at the same time, and I tried to draw a picture of it here, that in addition to being spiritual, circular, is also triangular. And so what I began to think about when I think about triangular, it's not one triangle, but two. There's systems and story and spirit, but there's also the self. Okay? And not just the self, but a society of selves. So it's not just individualistic, this notion, but it's a society of selves that are all related in a not a linear way, but at the same time a circular and a triangular way. That needs to be unpacked in itself, and I want to begin to draw pictures of that. I think that will become familiar or comfortable or to ourselves as we begin to think about our own environment. So the self and how we experience spirit systems in our stories. It makes meaning and it congeals within ourselves, but not just ourselves, but our community or our society of selves. And so let me just mention those two things just real quick.
Okay.
As a matter of explanation. One of the ways in which I believe all these things work together is in dialectical tension. That is, they both affirm part of themselves and deny a part of the other self. Okay, and from that, what comes out of that is neither one, but a synthesis, of both of them in kind of a way. And this takes place in a historical way, in which Hegel talks about as the Zeitgeist, or the spirit of the times. Okay, and I won't go any further than that.
Can you give an example of that dialectical tension?
I use the dialectic between religion and science is one. Where in many ways, if you really look at that, they have some things in common, but there are some things that deny one another. And when we began to talk about, especially in this COVID era, in the places where I was, that was in constant dialectical tension. You had your public health science, then you had your faith, or your spirituality, or your belief, and both of those are true to you at the same time. And so your behavior, what you decide to do, whether you decide to wear a mask or not wear a mask, gathering congregations or not congregations, are a synthesis of both these two. I may go to church, but I'm on a social distance and I'm going to use a mask. Maybe one way to do it. Or if it's not a synthesis, I'm going to ignore science altogether, or I'm going to ignore the nature of the social gathering altogether in religion. But for most of us in most societies, oftentimes a dialectic of the two. The term mutual critical correlation by David Tracy is another way of saying that. It says that they are both going together, they correlate, but they're critical of one another. Okay? They exist in the same universe, and they're seeking actually the same kind of ends as the betterment, and security and so forth. But they're both critical of one another. You can talk about Republicans and Democrats. You can talk about social ends versus economic ends. How all of those have a narrative. Now, one of the ways that another dialectic, that I think is critical for me, especially in the times that we live in, is the notion of white supremacy. As a dominant narrative of this country, that is told through its history, through its sociology, that's reflected in its economics and its educational systems. But there's also a countervailing force that also goes on, and that's found in our founding documents. Whether or not they were written with that intent or not, they're written there that all men are created equals, endowed with certain ineligible rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or our Christian understanding. We are created in the image of God, and each one of us will have an ultimate worth. So this notion of white supremacy and Martin Luther King and John Lewis, others, notion of the beloved community exists at the same time, in the same space oftentimes, and compete with one another. And if you look at history, you'll see a civil rights movement, that begins to move the nation one way, and then a backlash that comes back of conservatism that moves it back the other way. And we're right in the midst of that right now with what's happening with our politics, with Trump, as well as the Democrats and others that are and Republicans as well, that are seeking to have a competing narrative for the American consciousness.
So I definitely hear in that example story, competing narrative, and systems, like systemic racism. Where do you see spirit in that example?
Well, I think spirit undergirds it all. Many people, not all people, many people who were appalled by George Floyd, for instance, oftentimes didn't have a rational reason for that. It's something that has happened so many times before, but it's something that reached the spirit, and that's which connects us. So people say there's something wrong here. There's something wrong with the way we're relating to one another. Something wrong with it's not necessarily a rational thing, but it is something deep that is felt deeply and emotively. Okay, that this does not represent the spirit of a kind of community and nation that I believe myself to be at. Where on the other side, there are those with law and order, and who have a dominant narrative, that somehow this person was deserving of what happened to him, because of his class, his culture, his skin color, that comes out of centuries of white privilege, of historical snippet that said, this is right. I feel this. And instead of feeling the sympathy or the emotion or the compassion, they felt justification. So for me, I'm describing this phenomenologically. There's a Christian spirit that, that I have, that many others share, our Jewish spirit, many others share, that holds us to a narrative, a biblical narrative, that out of which, we feel a spirit, that we can critique the other part of society by. That's the critical correlation. We can critique it. Now there's another who read the same Bible, but deduce a different spirit. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, what I'm wondering, is there something about this time? Is there some value that could be offered to the world, to society, by really noticing the interplay between system, story, and spirit? What do you think?
I think the critical part of it is that these things are constructions. They are constructed things, okay? And when they become stable systems like we've had, I use the example of just Jonas Salk, the one who did polio. He had what's called an S curve of history. History goes along a curve, and they're stable systems. They're status quo, but there are certain junctures, what he called inflection points, where systems are no longer stable. War, famine, pestilence, revolution, all those kinds of things make a breaking point at which at that time there's opportunity of change the course of history for either good or bad. And so agency, is a spirit. For me, it's a spiritual attribute as well, that you have a spirit that you believe that you can make a difference. So at this point in history, and we're at that critical point in history where we have an opportunity to change history, by the actions that we take or the actions that we don't take. And so the beloved community and white supremacy, are in contrast. Which way will the synthesis go?
Yeah.
Will we become even more repressive, and more deterministic, or we become more liberating and more freedom? That depends upon us. They're not given. Systems are not given. They're constructed. Stories are not given. They're created. And so, in the spirit, the same way, it's also generated from all those connections. I think that's one of the, all of this has to do with relationships. They're all connected. And it's the nature of those connections and those relationships that are shaped by narratives, that are manifested by systems and perpetuated through systems, but are created and changed through a creative spirit.
Yeah, that helps too, to just think about spirit. Spirit comes through connection. Is that what you said?
That spirit is connection. Spirit is experience. It's the experience of my connection with you is of a spiritual nature. Okay? And how we relate to one another will also help to shape the spirit that we have together.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So it's not one or the other. It's not one. That's why I say it's not linear. Communities, you can feel the spirit in the communities, and by feeling, you can almost tell what the nature of the relationships are in that community.
Yeah. Well, thank you for setting all of this up. And so I think to your point is, if people are watching this, that there's going to be a series of interviews with the rest of the band members that I think continue to just add to this conversation. And as you said, maybe talk about it from some different angles and different views. So thank you for your time today, Dr. Fred Smith, and we'll see you soon.
Okay, thank you.